Greetings! Welcome back to Old Ways Rising Farm and another installment in our Introduction to Metal Casting video series. This little introduction is actually for two videos. We have two videos on making patterns for casting. Now, pattern making, up through the mid-century, right, mid-1900s, was a very, very important trade. Okay, everything that went through a foundry came from a pattern, right? So somebody sat down at a workbench and carved a pattern for that engine block, right? Those pistons, that steam engine back in the 1800s, that gear, that hand wheel for equipment, right? All of those things, all of those cast iron, or the metal cast iron for a fence, all of those things started with a wooden pattern that was then cast in sand. Okay, and these people are pretty much agreed to be like the top tier of skilled woodworkers, right? And nobody really disputes that. Now, in a world of CNC machines and rapid prototypers, that has kind of, an engineer works in CAD, and then CAD talks to a computer, and then the computer operates a rapid prototyper of some sort, whether that's 3D printing or milling or what have you, and out pops a pattern. So the making of wooden patterns is not nearly as important in industry today as it was, even just half a generation ago, right? So pattern making as a trade has kind of died out, and that's really sad. We're going to work on fixing that today. We're going to make some patterns, okay? We're in these two videos. Now, don't think I'm representing myself as one of those like top tier, pattern makers. No, no, no. This is a pared down, slimmed down introduction to the idea of pattern making and some of the things that go into it, right? We're not going to go work from blueprints and make a pattern to cast an engine block. No, this is not what we're doing. We're going to make some little fun things that you can screw up royally and still get a successful project out of, okay? So, we're going to make 4 patterns in 2 videos. I had originally conceived of this as a 1 video thing, and then it just got stupidly long. So it's going to be 2 videos, right? So this is the intro for both videos. All of these patterns play into other projects that we've been working on. So for example, the simplest pattern is what's called a flat back pattern, where you just slap it on a board, pack sand on it, and the cope is just flat, right? You just flat with a sprue coming down. Super easy to make, super easy to use. You can even use them in just a half mold and pour in the top. It's less accurate that way, but for a lot of things it'll work with a flat back pattern. And to make a flat back pattern, I have some of these ducks. This is a black duck that I carved. And I envisioned these as a decoy for moving water, so I've been trying to keep them very hydrodynamic here. And I need a hydrodynamic decoy weight, kind of like that. Okay, so we have a pattern for a lead weight for this bird. Like I said, something like this is a very good place to start making patterns, because this can be literally any shape you like. It doesn't have to be something specific. Okay, it just has to be something that you like. And you'll put this on a board, pack sand around it, and then pour metal into the cavity after removing the pattern. But even though it's a very simple form, there's a lot we can learn about pattern making from doing an exercise like this. Okay, so this is going to be pattern number 1. Second pattern that we're going to do in the first video comes from, this is a Cecil John decoy from Ontario. This is an old one, okay, not one of my carvings. And it does a trick. It has a swing weight. Okay, so what this does is it anchors the decoy side to side, resists motion, but it allows full freedom of motion front and back, so the bird looks like it's bobbing in the waves, rather than rocking side to side like a buoy. Okay? So it's a nice way to make a decoy weight. And it tucks in behind the decoy's butt so that they'll pack flat, so you can get more in a small area. Now this looks very much like Mr. Cecil John just drilled a hole into a stump and poured some lead in it with a wire. Okay, I want to do a little bit better than that and make a curved piece that will nest around the base of the decoys. Okay, so we're going to make a pattern for some swing weights. And this is going to go onto a match plate. Now, a match plate is a system where you have your mold situated on either side of a plate. You pack one side with sand. You flip it over. You pack the other side with sand. Then you pick up your sandboxes, and you discover that there's a pattern built into the board which has now made a cavity in your mold. And this is our curved swing weight. Okay? So it's asymmetrical. This is the fat side, which will go into the cope. And there's the skinny side, which will go into the drag. We have the gate system built right into the pattern. So all you have to do is you don't have to fumble around or worry about losing little loose patterns like these guys. Okay, you just have it built into the board. But you have to take into consideration some indexing, make sure things are lined up. So there's a little bit more difficulty in this, and it will be good experience with a two-piece pattern. Now, the indexing system that we use to get this lined up on either side of the board, you can have a loose two-piece pattern. Where you just have the two pieces, you have a dowel which goes down through one and into a hole in the other. You use one as a flat back pattern, flip your mold, put the other into the index holes, then pack it in. And then you remove it as a one-piece pattern. Okay? We're not doing one of those in this video series, but we are going to make this match plate. Okay, traditional wooden match plate. That will end the first video. But in the second video, we're going to look at, here it is, getting all my props around, these corners, these brass corners from campaign style furniture. We're going to make a pattern to cast these. Okay, so you can cast your own brass corners for this sort of work. Okay, now this has to be held, and we'll talk about why. These have to be held up at an angle, so we'll need to make a follow block, which will hold them. Okay. The third way of working with a pattern is pattern and a follow block. And then the fourth, these carvings I made a year ago, so I'm not carving these ducks in this video, but I have these two miniature, well, a duck and a loon. Two miniature waterfowl carvings that I'm going to cast to use as paperweights, drafting ducks specifically. And just like we need a holding device for those corners, and we'll talk about the reasons why here, we need a holding device for those corners, these, being round, won't sit flat unless they have a holding device. So here we have a board similar to a match plate, but instead of a two-part pattern being permanently attached, we have a holding system for two loose patterns. Okay? So you would pack one half of the mold, remove the board, remove the patterns, replace the patterns upside down in the cavity you just left in that mold, and then continue to pack the other half. So when you do this, you're making a board with a fixed cavity to hold loose patterns. This is then called a parting board. Okay? And this is the fourth way to handle patterns. These were already carved. I carved these a year ago, but I'll talk about how we make the rest of this structure to make a parting board to hold curved patterns like this. We're not going to do anything that has cores or moving parts or some of that really sophisticated pattern making. We're just going to get into some of these basics to get you started. Okay? So, if you're interested in this and you want to see how we've made all of these things, I hope that you'll join in, and I hope that you get something out of it, because this has been about a month and a half in the making of this video. So this is not one-day build territory, even though we're doing simplified patterns, right? This is not one-day build territory. I'm not exaggerating. I've been working about a month and a half on this 2-video set. So I hope you enjoy it, and we're going to get started explaining why some of these things are the way they are. Now, before we get going, I want to talk about some considerations that are specific to the patterns themselves to make it castable. In the previous video, we talked about mold making considerations. We talked about metal shrinkage and risers and pattern maker shrinkage. That's the first set of considerations. But even after that's taken into account, there's still some things that we need to look at with the patterns themselves. The first of these is what's called draft. So if you think about something being mounted in a cope and drag mold, let me just draw a cope and a drag here. There's a drag, here's a cope, and let's say I just have a square thing in here. If these are all 90-degree angles, that will not work, okay? Because you're going to have to pick the cope up off of the pattern, and then you're going to have to pull the pattern up out of the drag, okay? And in the process of doing this, if these are all 90 degrees, there's going to be so much friction between the sand and the pattern that you're going to break off all of the sand here in the corners. You're going to have a garbage mold cavity. And then again, once you try to pick the pattern up out, you're going to break this region. Okay. So instead of your nice square thing, you've got this monstrosity and you make a new mold. And then you're sad and frustrated. Mm-hmm. We don't want to be sad and frustrated. Life is sad and frustrating enough. Okay. We don't want problematic patterns to contribute to that. So if I wanted to cast this, I would need to have draft. Okay? Draft just means slope. Okay? So if this was going to go into a cope and drag mold in that same thing, I need to come out a little bit here in the middle and design some slope into it. Okay? In this configuration, it would come from both sides. This is exaggerated. And it doesn't have to be a lot. You only need 3 degrees here. Okay? But for mounting with the parting line in the middle, this would be 3 degrees up, 3 degrees down. And it's extending out from the main pattern. This is draft allowance. So this is the second allowance you need. And then if this is going to be machined back down, you have to leave a little bit of extra for machining then, because there'll often be a little warpage, right? So those are your 3 allowances. Pattern maker shrinkage, discussed in the previous video, draft, and machining, okay? If we were doing a flat-backed pattern, right, where it was just sitting up in the mold in one side only, okay, it's the simplest sort of pattern to make, then all of the draft would just come off of the bottom. And then the mold would pick up like that. Okay? Totally fair to do this. And again, this is exaggerated. That only needs to be 3 degrees. Okay? Curved is also fine, right? So if we have a flat back pattern that's curved over, also okay. Now, if you have enough draft on one side, you can get away with a little bit of a flat. Like this little duck pattern, there's so much curvature here across the back that this will pick up just fine. Because if you think about something, again, let's say that this is parting line in the mold. If we have a flat here, and then all of this is curved, when we go to pick it up, we won't pick it up completely straight. We'll pick it up with a little bit of sideways motion, and it'll just move into that draft that's been built into the one side. Okay? So things have to have draft. Now, there is a way to cheat. If you have something like this corner piece, that there just is no good way to design draft into the middle and then be able to remove that draft. You can cheat and create the illusion of draft by how you mount it. Okay, so let's go look at another mold. Draw a cope, draw a drag. Now let's say I wanted just the same square object. Well, if I mount that such that it goes into the mold at an angle, I still have perfect 90s all the way around. But because I mounted it in the mold, it now has the illusion of draft. So when this picks up, that will come out just fine. And then when we remove the pattern from the drag, it will come out just fine. Okay? So we've cheated the system a little bit. Now, there's another side. You would have to have draft on the side which is here facing the camera. But we cheated the system in one direction. Okay? So you can do this. Now, a simple flat back pattern like this, that's all you need to do. Any of these other things, you're going to have a holding device to make it possible to do this. So if we wanted to look at something like this type of pattern, okay, where we have the parting line in the middle, there's two ways you can get that into a castable form. One is we actually make it in two pieces. Okay. And then we have some sort of indexing system. Okay, pardon my sloppy drawing there, but right where we have a peg on one side and then a depression in the other. This you could use as a flat back pattern, pack your drag around it, flip it up, and then put the top on with that indexing pin, pack the sand around it, and then remove it as one piece. Okay, so you can do a two-piece split mold that way. You can also do a two-piece split mold where you have it permanently glued to a board. Okay, this is then called a match plate. So this is permanently attached here. You pack the drag in there, you pack the cope in here, then you remove both from the match plate, put your mold together, and you have that cavity in there. Okay. The other option is you make what's called a parting board, where we have a thick board with a depression in it, and then our part sits in that depression. Then you'll put the drag over, you'll pack it, you'll flip it up, and then you remove both the parting board and the pattern from the drag, and then you take the pattern and put it back in the depression in the drag, and then pack the top in as though it's a loose pattern. Okay? So this is called a match plate. This is called a parting board. We're going to make both of these in this series. And I'm pretty sure I stumbled over calling one the other a time or two as I was just ad-libbing and working on a project, but this is properly called a match plate. That is properly called a parting board. So I'm just going to correct myself here at the beginning. And these are the considerations that we will work with. And we're going to show all of not all possible combinations of these different ways of making and holding patterns, but we will show all of the main ideas here. Okay. Now, in this first video, like I said, we're going to talk about some flat back patterns, and we're going to talk about a split pattern on a match plate. Okay. And then in the second video, we're going to be looking at those corners, and we're going to make a follow block which holds a loose pattern so that you can cheat this way. And we're going to make a parting board for some of these duck decoys. Okay, these little miniature paperweight duck decoys. Before we do that, the last little introductory thing I want to talk a bit about here is when you're making a pattern, this is not the main part. Okay? When we're doing a carving, like these duck decoys, you make it once and that's the finished thing, and then you carve another one if you want another one. When I'm doing that, I like tool mark finishes. I like to lean into the folk art aspects of a lot of what I do. But when you're making a pattern, you want to make this pattern perfect. So a different set of things matter. Okay? You see, this is completely sanded smooth. A tool mark pattern can create undercuts that you don't realize are there and can be more difficult to cast than a smooth pattern, right? So I very much recommend a smooth pattern. Okay. When you're making this, though this is the finished thing, a scratch only matters if it's deep enough that it will hold sand and affect your cavity. Okay. So if I paint this up and there's a little sanding scratch, I don't really care. Okay, because it's not going to hold sand. It's not going to, like, if you look at this painted one, right? So if there's a little spot, right, like there's a couple sanding scratches right there. Those won't hold sand. They won't interfere with the ability to cast this little paperweight. So I don't care about them. But I'm not going to forgive a little blemish that could just be character on a hand-carved one-and-done object. Okay, I will fill that in and then resand it back, because this is going to make many, many replicas. So the basic form needs to be perfect. As you can see on this one, I carved the head on this little ruddy duck about 5 times. I carved it and I didn't think it was perfect, so I put some epoxy putty on, let it harden, carved again. Learned from that, still didn't think it was perfect, build it back up again, carved it again. Right? And that's fine. Now, I think that this sort of putty-filled appearance is kind of ugly, but all I'm going to do is spray it with a gloss coat and use it as a casting pattern. So I would care about this if it was a one-and-done folk art carving, but I don't care about this for a casting pattern, right? I do care about having it absolutely perfect for a casting pattern, which I wouldn't care about for a folk art carving. So there's a different set of things that really matter in the different art forms. Okay? If a blemish is on the pattern big enough to catch sand, I care about it. Now, if I was going to take this and paint it as a folk art carving, and it was already sanded smooth, I would then care about every last one of those little sanding scratches, because again, they would matter, right? So do keep in mind what really matters and what can be dismissed. Now, without further ado, let's get into actually making some patterns. So to start off this conversation, I want to talk first about the absolute simplest possible type of sand casting pattern. And that's something with a flat bottom that's going to remain flat, so you can set it on a surface, put your flask around it, pack sand in, remove it, pour metal in the cavity. Okay, the absolute simplest imaginable type of molding. So this is going to be a little weight. This will be cast in lead. And this will be a little weight for decoys. Let me grab decoy. This one's not finished painting yet. It's decoy in progress, but you'll get the idea. So this sits perfectly fine just sitting here on my bench. But on water, it needs a little bit of weight on the bottom as a counterbalance to keep it upright. Okay, is all this in frame, beloved? Okay. So I need to cast a couple of these, and you can have them solid or some you can do swing weights, and I'm going to work on both of those for some different types of decoys here. And this will be one of those weights. Now, obviously I want to round it off a bit, have it a little bit more nicer looking and hydrodynamic. But before I even talk about that, we need to recognize that this, in its current configuration, is uncastable because it doesn't have what's called draft. So if you look at this, if I put a square against this, you can see that these are 90-degree angles. So yes, I can put this on a board, I can put a flask around it, I can pack sand on it, I can flip it over. But now when this is flipped over in the sand, I can't pull it out without the sand caving in. There will be too much friction between these sidewalls and the sand itself. Every pattern that you cast, anywhere you have a vertical edge, that edge must slope inward at least 3 degrees. Okay? More than 3 degrees, more slope is more better, to the point that you lose the ability to cast the thing that you want to cast. Right? If you want something with 90-degree edges, I don't for this, so this is fine. I'm going to way exceed 3 degrees on this piece when it's done. But if you want something with 90-degree edges, you want to keep it minimal to that 3 degrees, and then you need to go out. And you need to make your piece oversized. Okay, this is one of your allowances. We've talked in previous videos about pattern maker shrinkage. That's one of your allowances. Draft allowance is the second allowance. Okay, so you need to have it bigger by pattern maker shrinkage and bigger by that 3-degree draft so that you can file it or mill it down square. And then if you need really precise tolerances on something, you also have to have a machining tolerance. Okay. Now, we don't care about any of those. We just need to have a doodad out of lead that's somewhat nicely shaped and I can screw to the bottom of a block of pine. But in order to make it castable, I have to have draft, and this is what draft looks like. Okay? So if you look at this one, and I put the square against it, you can see that slopes. Okay? So I'm just going to talk a minute, and I'll show you a couple steps along the way of shaping these little patterns. Okay? So these started out identical, and it's just 4 inches long with a 1/2 inch in for the screw flange. And then to get the draft in, I just kind of guesstimated about a 1/4 inch, draw a reference line on both sides, about a 1/4 inch in. I just want to keep it even. Is this in view, beloved? Mm-hmm. Okay. Then your friend for this kind of project is a rasp. So I'm just going to start by rasping off this top knot a little bit, just so that it can grip in the vise easier. Anytime you remove a layout line, restore your layout line. Okay. And then we can lock it in the vise. And then just start rasping that. Down. Until we get it so that we have a nice even facet all the way across there without having it dished out. Always work in square section first. Okay? Now I want this here to be sort of curved. So again, I'm just going to bob the corners with the rasp. Working in square section first. And it's going to move a little bit. I'm a little awkward in how I'm set up here, because I'm trying to do this so I can see and you can see at the same time, and that doesn't always work so well. Check it. Make sure your square section is nice and where you want it. And then round it off. I should say the initial layout of this, 4 inches long, 1/2 inch allowance there for the screw flanges, and then from that 1/2 inch mark, that's just a 30-degree angle from both sides until they met. Again, this doesn't have to be any particular size, just has to be reasonable for the purpose. Okay? So there is my roundness. But again, that's 90 degree. That has to have draft too. So I need to come up more on that. I'm not removing so much material here, I can't just hold it. Kind of bracing my hand against the edge of the vise. Okay. And then for something at this level, this simple, all I need to do to check to make sure it's okay is to put the square down and make sure, just by looking around here, that when the square touches at this lower corner, it doesn't touch anywhere else. And if that condition is true, it's good enough for this particular project. Okay? And then I can just go to working on the rest of it, rounding all of this over, and I won't bore you with all of that rasping, but you can see where we're going with it. Set your draft, make sure it's consistent, establish it throughout, then go for your final shaping. I'm going to do this final shaping off camera, and then I'll show you what it looks like when we're all done. This is mostly shaped, and it's starting to look like a thing that would interact with the water reasonably well. The last thing that we need to do here is make sure, and I've already done it on this side, I'm going to show you on the other side, that this transition down from the top down to this little flange, okay, has a nice radius to it. If that is a 90-degree corner, what will happen is as the metal shrinks and pulls in opposite directions, it'll actually form a crack, and the two pieces can start to crack and pull apart from each other. On something this robust, out of a super soft metal like lead, that's not going to do anything in its life other than ride upside down on a duck, that really wouldn't matter that much. But when we start to get into functional parts and more precise castings and some of the other things we're going to look at in this video, that really starts to matter. So let's get in good practice now. So here on this one, you can see I've roughed it out. There's a little bit of a lip here. And in some places this is a little bit undercut. In other places it is vertical. Either will catch sand, and neither is that nice even curved transition. So I'm just going to take a small little rat tail file here and just start to kind of cut in and work that edge up. Okay. Now I always want the direction of force to be up because I don't want to cut into my flange here. Okay. And doing this with the rat tail file, you can also do this with a half round, depending on what kind of radius you have there. Guarantees that it cannot possibly turn into a 90-degree angle. Okay. If you use this to try and do it and get under there and roll it up, yeah, you can do it, but you can also very easily make a lot of undercuts. If you do this with the rat tail, you can work down too. Key is keep it moving and keep it moving away from the surface you want to protect. Okay? Okay, you can just keep carving on it there. This is cherry wood, it's scraps from making the flasks. Um, I do like carving hardwoods in general with files is sort of my primary tool. Okay, and then when we have it where we want it, sandpaper is your final tool. And again, you can kind of roll this up, kind of roll it and fold it so you have a nice radius there to work with. And then we do the finish work with the sandpaper, okay? And as you're finishing it up, if you discover that you have a little gouge in there somewhere that you can't quite get out, that's what putty's for. You're making a pattern. Till this is all said and done, it's going to be completely painted. Painted with, good primer, painted with a gloss finish to keep the sand from sticking. You're not going to see what's under here anyway. I do like using hardwoods for patterns because they will hold up better than some of the real soft pine to stamping the sand on top of. But if you're only going to ever make one casting out of a pattern, you can make it out of balsa wood if you want to, right? It'll hold up well enough to make you one casting. But I'm hoping to get more than that out of these. Okay. So that's the basic progress for the simplest form of pattern, where you go from the square block, which can't be cast, to something with draft that can be cast, to something nice that you want to cast. So you can see we have this. This is a little bit of body putty in there. Don't be afraid to do that. It is not a failure if you need to use a little putty to fill stuff in. For this sort of thing where I just had a deep saw gouge, any of the soft wood putties that are easy to sand are going to work. When you start talking about something that you carved off too much, you want to fill in a big void, and you want it to be strong, go to something like epoxy or Bondo. But as we go through this pattern making video, you'll see a lot of putty on a lot of things, right? This is a pattern to make the finished object. This is not in and of itself the finished object, right? So take the time to put that little piece of putty in there. Get it perfect, right? Get it perfect. When I'm just carving a decoy, I'm fine with a little nick or a little cut, or I like a tool mark surface anyway. It's character, it's folk art, that's part of it, right? But when you do something like this, get it perfect. Get it perfect, get it perfect. Use a little putty to do that. So, have a couple different sizes there. Flat back patterns, the simplest form. Just want to quick show you the final results here. This is the largest of the 4 weights. Again, fitting on this here decoy thusly, right? And the middle size, about half as much, and the light one about half as heavy as the middle size. So we have 3 weights of these cast in lead, 3 different weights if we were to cast them in copper, 3 different weights if we were to cast them in aluminum or pot metal. So doing this sort of project, you have more options, right? More than just one way of doing things. Now, this is future me redoing an outro to this video because I'd originally conceived of these all fitting together into one big story, and then halfway through decided this was way too long. I'd have to cut it in 2, and then started stitching the first one of those together and realized it was still way too long. So, I'm ending this particular video with this one project, but I do hope that you will, subscribe and make sure you don't miss the second one, which will, again, be this match plate. So, I hope that you'll join us for this, and we'll see you here next time at Old Ways Rising Farm.